Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. We will discuss on global value chain. Our other speakers also join, Mr. Rob Enderley, and we have world famous speakers, Mr. David Smith. First, I would like to give chance, Mr. David Smith.
Well, Sharif, thank you so much on this. The whole area of global value change is something that, if you look closely, has changed a lot. And the trajectory of global value change is pre-COVID, during COVID, and I want to say post-COVID, but we're really not post-COVID with the new XDD variant, have dramatically changed a lot. And if you look at global value change, it's the international way that companies have begun to fragment their production, fragment their supply chain, fragment the other elements. And this global value change can lead to increases in job creation, economic growth. But for countries to really benefit from it, particularly post uh, COVID, uh, countries need to put in place the right type of trade and investment policies to do it. And the pandemic has really highlighted the need to understand the dependencies of many countries on suppliers around the world. And so global value chains really are companies used to make things in the past in one country. Today, a single finished product might result from manufacturing in multiple countries, assembly in multiple countries, raw materials, finished products from multiple countries, all taking a step and adding value to the end product. And through these global value chains, countries trade more than products. They trade know-how. They make things together. The import of good and export of goods and services matter as much as all the individual pieces. And uh, countries are beginning to look more about how these global value chains play in place. Some of the shortages we see in semiconductor chips, some of the shortages we see in prescription medicine, in many different areas, in food stock and others, are because the global value chains have been disrupted and really put in different text. But these global value chains are a powerful driver of productivity growth, job creation, and increased living standards. But then they also can be disruptive. You see countries that are involved in them, they tend to be able to grow a little bit faster with a little bit higher employment and stuff. And what is good for this is that it's not just developed nations, but developing nations are becoming a very important part of these global value chains. But we see the bad side too. For example, we saw that at the outbreak of COVID, when China shut down many of its manufacturing facilities, it rippled negatively around the whole world. And countries like the United States, countries like in Europe and others said, we had closed all of our manufacturing facilities. We closed many of our raw material operations. And now we feel kind of helpless. And they begin to reopen them, begin to put those things back in place. And I think that's a trend you're going to see continuing. To start a new factory, the mean time is typically 2 to 4 years, depending what area the factory's manufacturing in. So we're just now beginning to see the fast ones come online and be productive. Um, I began to look in the developing countries. Some of them have fully embarked into the global value chain, but they're still really facing challenges in aligning these global value chains with their national development strategies, with their national education strategies, with the way they as a country look at their finances and their priorities. And other developing countries are looking at global value chains as recreating maybe core versus peripheral patterns. Maybe good jobs are concentrated in the north of the country and bad jobs in the south, or vice versa. And you're seeing that the global value chains, particularly in developing countries, are not distributed equally, nor are they in most of developed countries either. But you see that the inclusion in global value chains results in a significant boost in a country's competitiveness that can be delivered by combining competitive cost of production, competitive cost to the materials with high technologies. And there's just a lot of opportunities there. I have some other statistics and things we can talk about down the road, but I think this is not a bad introduction to get started and let other people throw in their 2 cents right now.
Thank you, Mr. Rob.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot to mute. Global value chains, they're in decline at the moment. The combination of the threat to Taiwan, the war in Ukraine, and the pandemic have caused large companies to shift from looking at low-cost suppliers, or focusing their supply on low-cost suppliers, to focusing supply on suppliers that they can, to a certain extent, be more assured, can more assure. Manufacturing of microprocessors, for instance, is being moved to a large extent back into the United States for the companies that typically would buy microprocessors in Taiwan. The Ukraine woke everybody up to the fact that Ukraine did manufacture a lot of ASICs because it was cheaper to manufacture there. Well, that's all shut down now. So a lot of the problem we've got right now with manufacturing and not getting parts is because of ASICs. Taiwan's actually producing okay at the moment. So it's not microprocessors, it's ASICs. And regardless of the problem, if you can't get parts, if you can't get your products finished into market, you're going to be laying people off and shutting down factories, and it's really expensive to shut down factories. So you've got your big automakers that are trying to keep manufacturing going, and they're building incomplete cars. They're showing up on lots because they can't put parts in them. You've got other manufacturers that have had to discontinue certain features of automobiles because they can't get parts for them. So, for instance, I was going to go out and buy a new car myself this year, but the car that's like mine in the market, you can't get the features that I have on mine. And I'm not buying a car that's been crippled. And a lot of people are coming to that same conclusion. So in the end, right now, because of the concerns of the pandemic and the potential war in Taiwan and the actual war in Ukraine, the firms are moving away from globalization and moving back into some nationalistic, centralized manufacturing scheme, with Apple probably being the poster child for vertical integration. And that was really the way the market used to be. If we came out of the 50s and 60s, very often the company would build it themselves and not outsource. An automotive company would own their supply chain, and that of course changed in the decades that followed. But now it looks like that pendulum is swinging back, and companies want to either own or control their supply chain, and they want it, if at all possible, to be domestic to increase that control. So we've shifted from cost-based decisions to control-based decisions. They want to make sure that they can get the stuff to market, because they've recognized, again, that if you can't get your parts, you can't build your product, and that's problematic. It's particularly problematic for geographies that largely build parts, particularly if those geographies are in Asia, because the conflict, while the Ukraine conflict isn't having a significant impact on Asia, the pandemic is, and certainly the threat of China attacking Taiwan is, because that could shut down that entire part of the world in terms of traffic. You've got an active war going on. It's going to be tough to get captains to pilot ships, tough to get aircraft in the air, because mistakes will be made and those crews will be put at risk. So in the end, even though it's not happening at the moment, the concerns about it happening are changing decisions and forcing a different model. It hasn't gone very far yet, and prices often can be an overriding factor. So, for instance, if it costs 50% more to build something domestically than it is to build it overseas, then a company is likely to take the risk of building it overseas for the short-term benefit against the long-term risk. However, if it's smaller than that, if it's 10% or 15%, they might look at this like insurance and be willing to pay the extra freight in order to get the job done. Now, another aspect that's coming in through and making a difference is often it's labor, cost of labor, that cause companies to shift this manufacturing capacity to other countries to begin with. Some countries are far cheaper with labor than others. But as we move to robotics and automation, that's going to change. A robot is a robot, and it's not like a robot charges more for its labor in the United States than it does in China. You don't have wages with automation. Now, in some regions where they've got a heavy population and they need to keep their citizens employed or they'll revolt, they're going to be unwilling to go to robotics. But in areas where they're facing these kinds of problems, where they want control, they want to be able to be assured that their supply chain is viable and robust, they're going to invest in robotics, even if it doesn't make economic sense, even if they can get labor more cheaply. So the end result is robotics is going to make a play here as we start turning factories to what basically are large scale 3D printers, and then you'll be able to put those factories regardless of what the labor cost is, because your labor cost is going to be reduced as a result of robotics. Then you're going to be looking at things like transport. How far away is the facility from where the source material is, and what can you do to reduce the transport cost? And that's going to result in a different kind of analysis, even if we don't have pandemics and wars going on, because the metrics are different. Now you're talking about transport as opposed to labor. And again, it might make more sense to have the factories closer to where you're going to distribute or sell than it will be to have them close to where labor is cheaper, since the labor won't be a factor anymore. And then finally, and I know you guys talked about it yesterday, and I hardly missed it, is the emergence of this next generation of artificial intelligence, which will allow a lot of this stuff to not only be remote, but not require any type of supervision or employees at all. And certainly there are discussions about putting things like data centers underneath the ocean, where you don't need to transport goods to and from, and you can use wave motion generators to power them, and the ocean provides a place to better dissipate the heat, a more cost-effective way to dissipate the heat than on land, because water is a higher conductor than air is. And that could allow you to do certain things. Certain types of manufacturing might make more sense on or in the ocean as opposed to on land, and still be relatively close to where you're going to do things. For instance, if you're manufacturing microprocessors or memory chips, where the influx of radiation can cause the material to degrade, placing them underneath water could shield that manufacturing plant from getting the kinds of defects that a land-based manufacturing plant would make, and transporting what is relatively small amounts of material in and out of some of those plants for things like supercomputers and low volume, high performance computers, major machines, could be cost effective and cause us to actually look at different ways to manufacture and different places to manufacture going forward. Shame we don't have Atlantis. So in the end, we're in flux. We're in flux because of the pandemic. We're in flux because of the wars, and we're in flux because of a massive change in how we're building stuff going on at the moment. A shift to robotics, a shift to next generation artificial intelligence, and over the next 10 to 15 years, I think we'll be looking at the global supply chain very differently than we are today. And with bellwethers like Apple shifting to vertical integration, we are likely going to continue on this vertical integration path until one of these other factors makes a defining statement and causes people to once again rethink their supply chain. So for now, as we look at the global value chain, it's in massive flux, and until it settles with multiple instances of variables that are also in flux, I don't think we're going to have a good idea of where we're going to end up yet. We might not really have a good sense of what's happening until say around 2050, when we can look back at this overall event and say, this is what happened, and this is actually why it happened. Right now, it's mostly speculation and people making decisions from their gut, and the end result is a lot of those decisions are likely to be wrong. But we don't know. But right now, it's very difficult to tell why. I guess finally, if I were to point to anything and provide some advice, too many companies are thinking tactically about this stuff. They need to start thinking strategically about where they want to be in a 15-year time frame and make sure they're making decisions against that metric. Because if you spin too hard against current events, and the wars will abate, the pandemic will abate and change, robotics will eventually come in and be stable. You need to anticipate the world as it will exist in that time and build against that, which means you need flexibility, you need agility, you need to make sure you don't lock yourself into any one model, because with so many things in flux, determining what the actual outcome will be at this particular point in time is going to be difficult. But what you can determine is if you make too many changes too quickly, you will introduce too many variables that then you then will have trouble managing, and you'll make things worse instead of better. And Talib, I think you're up next.
Thank you. Now I request Dr. Talib Rafael.
You're muted, or your microphone's not broadcasting. We can't hear you. You're not muted on the app. We can see you, and we should be able to hear you, but we have no sound. So it's either not pulling from the right microphone, or you don't have a microphone enabled. Nope, still can't hear you. You can see lips moving. See, this is where we need an AI to be able to read lips and give Talib his voice. Of course, the danger would make him sound like Tweety Bird or something. It provide too much humor. Now, still can't hear you. Nope. Can see your lips moving, but no sound.
Dr. Talib, I think you can join again. Maybe this is one of the way.
Or we could practice smoke signals or hand signs.
Now I request Mr. David.
Modern AI might help there, Rob. Well, Sharif, thank you. Yeah, this is, in some funny ways, what just happened explain also some of the difficulties with global value chains, and that sometimes all the technology doesn't go right. And those are some of the challenges you see there. Dr. Lee, let's see if he can go ahead and talk.
Okay?
Yes.
It is good. Go ahead.
Yes.
Good. Okay. I was saying this is a political game altogether. You're speaking from an American perspective, Rob and David. But Rob, now, what would China do about this? I mean by China, I mean mainland China. I don't mean Taiwan, because Taiwan is going to be part of China, whether we like it or not. That's going to be the case. If not today, to tomorrow, definitely. So the issue is, it's an American problem, really. It's the issue of value chains and the piece being manufactured in China, mainly China, and the rest of the world, of course. But this is a decision that was taken by businesses a long time ago in the United States, because they thought that they would be saving some money on that. Now, it's proven to be a wrong decision, because politics are not working in their favor. But I think the businesses will eventually help the politics, will go their way. And there's going to be a showdown between America and China on this thing, as you all are predicting. Now, in China, they don't have this problem. If there was a Chinese amongst us, he would not know what you're talking about, Rob. I mean, he would not say things that you said at all. That's what I want to say for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now it is Mr. David here.
Well, Sharif, I agree that both Rob and I have a American-centric view, uh, and it's hard to because we're living in that type of area, um, and
Nothing wrong with that.
and but on the other hand, um, as I talk to my friends around the world and things, and um, look at options and things, I hope that I'm seeing more of a global view coming back into it and even understand the nuances. The chart, which is up on the screen right now, is a very interesting one because what you see global value chains tend to either be production based or trade based. And this shows you some of the volatility in them as both of them are going up. The production base tends to be higher than the trade base, but you can see really a lot of the volatility in there. And particularly when you look where COVID hit, which is where this start decline is at the end of it. The one in the middle of the decline was the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And you can see how those two things dramatically affected the global value chains that you see here. Um, and just that
Downfall,
little bit of data,
Donald, David, downfall is that of COVID, right?
right. And COVID hit in the time period between 2015, 2020, where the sharp declines are.
Yeah.
And you can see production was hit even harder than services and the amount of decline. But beginning to go a bit further, this is looking at the top countries in the world that have the global value chains. And you can see Germany, the United States, China, the Netherlands, France are really the top five by magnitude back in 2019, which is kind of where these numbers are. But then if you go and look at the bottom part of this, you look and see where the ones were growing the most. It was in Cambodia, in Laos, in Vietnam, in Nepal, in Mongolia. So this is where the developing nation is really picking up speed. So this chart does a pretty good job of showing the top ones by magnitude, but then the top five by growth. And PRC, if you begin to look at, I'm sorry, China, if you begin to look at the numbers, really has been growing a lot between it, both with the gross exports and the indirect exports as well. So you're seeing that trading out there. But for this program, Sharif, I wanted to pull up one other one. And this is looking at the global value chain participation for selected countries. So if you look at Bangladesh, if you look at Pakistan, Colombia, Turkey, and look at them in textiles production, you see the ranking. If you go down and look at electronics, optical equipment, you see it's a different set of countries there. But all of these participate in this global value chain participation. And you can begin to see the differences, like in Bangladesh, the global value chain for textile and textile products is 7.5% of gross domestic product. You look in Colombia, and it's in Cambodia, it's 12%. So you see the impacts on the different ones and how important they are to the nation. And this type of participation is one that is, as Rob said and I said earlier, I, and actually in some ways that Dr. Philippe said as well, it's pulling back from it, and we're going to see them decrease as we make the changes on it. This is just the last one, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is how the accounting framework works when you look at global value chains. And you need to begin to understand it's not just a single calculation that lets you understand uh, the impact to the nations of the global value chains and the impacts to the companies. They really go through many other variations of it too, and it's a complicated one. And part of what we need to understand is that a global value chains often get confused with labor and others as outsourcing. And it's one of the most interesting discussions I've had with governments in particular. For example, I was designing bio crossroads for the state of Indiana, which is their life science plan. But Indiana has a lot of manufacturing, or had a lot of manufacturing, and they were bemoaning how much of their manufacturing was going overseas in different places like that, and how bad that was. But on the other hand, you saw Toyota establishing large factories there. You saw companies from Europe establishing large factories there, and others like that. And what they couldn't understand is that from Japan, from Korea, from Europe, they're outsourcing that manufacturing to Indiana. And that was part of really establishing these global value chains. And that's one of the misconceptions that people have, is it's not a some loss, some gain game. It's how you work in a global economy. Now, as Rob said, and I said earlier, COVID has really forced us to look at our risk factors. And and today, with the disruptions, I mean, even today off the coast of California, in a US centric view, there's hundreds of cargo ships up there lined up trying to put goods off, and they cannot go through the port right now because of labor shortages. You see that globally. You see the shortages of raw materials, and it's hard to manufacture if you don't have the raw materials that are the basis for the goods you're manufacturing. And all of these are disrupted because the global value logistics is disrupted, which is part of the global value chain. Um, and it's going to take, I believe, years to sort out this changing dynamic of where manufacturing is beginning to be recentered, and the fact that I think you're not going to see a single country become dominant on any sector again. I think you're going to see manufacturing more distributed around the world. And yes, as Rob said, if there's places where it can be done 50% cheaper, it's going to be hard to justify that. But I think you're going to see many countries and many companies begin to even make hard decisions like that. Do we raise price to have the ability to survive in times of a pandemic, to survive in times of others? Sharif, your program on the global measles uh, epidemic right now, I'm seeing that impact places. And following up on that, there's factories in India that have shut down because of the measles outbreaks there, and it's spreading. Um, like I said, there's one city in Ohio here which has such a growth in measles that they're actually shutting down schools and some of the factories to try to head it off because people are not getting vaccinated. And you're seeing those type of things going to extend into the global value chain as well, with the reactions to the pandemic, the reactions to the vaccines, uh, and the reaction, as Rob said, to the conflicts and the war. And Dr. Talib, I believe with you that China will probably go ahead and take Taiwan. I think it's going to be uh, a global disruption, uh, not just geopolitically, but economic and rifling many places. But the handwriting's pretty clear on the wall there. We see how Ukraine and has disrupted, particularly food, software productions, and others. I had a really fantastic software development team in Ukraine, which half of that uh, development team has died during the conflict. Uh, and that is missing. Looking at the widespread destruction in Ukraine, it's going to become an epic center for reconstruction when the conflict does end. You see whole cities almost leveled. So you're going to see that type of going. But the global value chain is an economic driver, and it is also an economic challenge when there's disruptions in the value chain. So you have to take the good with the bad. And Dr. Tlaib, I agree with you 100. I tend to look from a U.S. centric view. But if you look at those top 5 countries that in the global value chain participation, you can see it really is a global phenomenon, and how uh, it affects quite a few. And the fact that Germany is the top ranked of all the nations in the global value chain, uh, to me is also an exclamation point put on it, that it's really is a distributed approach. And Dr. Sharif, I think that's kind of what I can say right now.
Thank you, Mr. Rob.
Yeah, thanks, David. So it does point to the fact that politics do play a major role here. China was on the path of being the best country to outsource to from a standpoint of cost, manufacturing capacity, raw materials, you name it. And had they continued on the path they were on, certainly by 2050, the vast majority of the world's manufacturing would have been occurring in China. The decisions by the Chinese government changed that, and not for the better as far as China was concerned. Their mishandling of the pandemic, their warlike stance against Taiwan, in the context of Ukraine, has created concerns for everybody that manufactures in China, which is one of the reasons why companies like Apple are starting to vertically integrate and pull their manufacturing out of China and move it to other places. Now, the other places might be places like Vietnam, but right now the general sense is you don't want to be building anything in China because they're unreliable. It really has nothing to do with where you like their politics or not. Most of the companies didn't really care about China's politics until those politics started to have an adverse impact on supply, and then they cared a lot. And so the risk that China represents to the supply chain is having an adverse impact on people wanting to build things there and build things anywhere close to that vicinity where that particular supply chain might be disrupted. It's also causing people to really rethink redundancy. How many vendors can we get to build a certain part? So if we lose 1 or 2 of them, we can still stay in manufacturing by adjusting volumes in the vendors that we have versus the vendors that we've lost. And that's become kind of problematic, though, because often what happens when you've got a supplier is they manage out their manufacturing capacity, and they're running it close to 100%, if at all possible. And so if you lose one vendor that's supplying a part and you now try to fail over to your backup vendor, they may not have the capacity for you. That was happening a lot in the microprocessor industry, where if one manufacturer wasn't able to do it, the company wanted to fail over to another, only to find that other manufacturer, one, because they were a minor player there to begin with, didn't take them as a priority. And number 2 is they didn't have the capacity to give them. If they gave them capacity, they'd have to take capacity from somebody else, and that somebody else might be a better client than they are. So that lack of flexibility, even when you had redundant vendors, has become seriously compromised. And that's really why this idea of insourcing, of going back in and either owning or controlling your suppliers and having them be domestic as opposed to foreign, has become a trend. It's back to control. We can't control the Chinese government. They're doing bad stuff. So let's get the stuff out of China. But okay, so we put it in Vietnam. Well, we can't control Vietnam. So far, their government's doing really good things, but who says that's going to last? Now I'm concerned about a risk that may never emerge, and that's factoring into my decisions. If there was ever a case where we really needed large global models of supply chain and be able to run simulations against those models, that time is now. We don't, and we aren't. though that's changing. Our ability to create simulations to scale, thanks to tools like NVIDIA's Omniverse, have increased significantly, allowing us to run simulations across things like supply chains. We're just not doing it yet. We're focusing the simulation models in the military, autonomous vehicles, and robotics at the moment, not necessarily operations, and I think that's a mistake. Particularly as a lot of these decisions are made, as I mentioned in my last go-around, I think a lot of decisions are currently being made on supply chain are going to turn out to be wrong because we cannot determine what's going to happen. And a lot of these decisions are made because of fear of what may happen, not knowledge that it will happen. And as we've seen with regard to the recession in the United States, if you have enough people acting on the belief that something will happen, they can cause that thing to happen. So for instance, the recession proclamation in the United States will likely occur largely because companies are doing large layoffs, are cutting back dramatically, and doing the very things that could trigger a recession, even if it didn't occur naturally. Thus, recession prediction becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that in of itself is problematic because nobody wants a recession. So in the end, we need better supply chain models. We need a better handle on what's going on with regard to government, so we can better predict whether the government will remain stable or destabilize, creating problems with our supply chain. And we certainly need a better way to ramp redundant suppliers than we currently have, and a way to get a sense of how to get those suppliers to step up, or whether they will step up when we need them to do this. It's interesting that we have a parallel in IT redundancy, where often companies would have backup IT sites that were kept hot and ready, but largely non-working in case there was a failover. And there may be an argument for creating suppliers that are capable of building things, but may in fact be held in abeyance until something occurs, so we can then ramp those secondary manufacturing sites up. And certainly with regard to the war in Ukraine, being able to ship manufacturing workers who are leaving Ukraine for safety reasons to another manufacturing site, say that was being held in abeyance in Poland, for instance, and spin that up, would have been a workable model if anybody put that in place, but would have needed to be in place ahead of time. Now it's kind of happening ad hoc, but in the end, now that we've seen the occurrence, there is an argument that suggests that there may eventually be a market for these hot manufacturing sites that may be equipped with obsolete or semi-obsolete equipment that's come out of sites that are running. But that can be spun up and be made operational in case those primary sites become unavailable. And same thing could occur if the site is located in an area where you've got unreasonable weather. One of the factors I didn't mention was global climate change, which is having an adverse impact on manufacturing capacity. I mean, if you look at California, a good chunk of that state is currently underwater. You can't move goods around in parts of the state. There are manufacturing sites that are flooded and non-viable at the moment, and that can happen any place in the world. We've had large areas of Asia come under flood on and off, and when you have that chance for a major weather catastrophe, again, you still need to build product. And you're evacuating people from the location. If you had a place to evacuate them to, so not only could they continue to work, but they'd have a safe place to live. That would allow you to keep your manufacturing up and running, and secondarily, you'd help the poor people that have been forced out of their homes and forced out of their jobs to be productive again, to have a safe place to put their families. Where we really don't have that kind of capability at the moment. Where when people evacuate from an area, we're putting up tent cities, temporary structures. We have no way to put these people to work. They become areas where you've got lots of people with lots of free time. You've got an overabundance of crime against people and against each other, and huge problems with supplying food and resources to the facility that could have been addressed had hot sites, had warm sites been set up that can be converted to hot sites in case of a disaster. So this idea of having some level of redundancy in terms of manufacturing and living, short of arcologies, which is another concept I honestly think we should revisit. the ability to put living and manufacturing in a contained area that then can be protected and secured against a hostile action would make a lot of sense. Let's say if Ukraine, for instance, had a lot of arcologies, it would be a lot easier to defend those arcologies, which are very centralized, with limited resources than it is to defend cities, which are very spread out and make it very difficult for missile defense systems to work. And so beyond the weather and in case of war, you could better defend the people and better defend the manufacturing capacity, which Ukraine desperately needs right now and has lost most of. So in the end, whether we're talking about war, climate change, pandemic, or governments that have lost their minds and are thinking tactically and not strategically, that's all having an adverse impact and should be forcing a sea change in how we think about supply chain and think about building redundancy, think about building global models, and really think about making these decisions strategically. So we're not constantly tactically responding to events. We have a strategic plan to deal with them, and thereby, when there is a problem, we can address the problem with competence rather than running around like chickens with their heads cut off trying to figure out what we're going to do, which is what we're seeing at the moment. A lot of panic, a lot of gut decisions that are not founded by fact. And the end result, I'm afraid, is going to make things worse before it gets better. And we have the capability, we have the technology, we have the capacity to solve this problem in a way it doesn't need to be as big as it is. We just aren't focusing the resources where they need to be focused to make that happen.
Thank you, Dr. Talib Rafael.
Okay. Now, what Rob and David decided to do is make sure that this problem is global, not just American, but a global problem, which is a fact. It is a global problem. That I agree with. But the point is, let's if it's global, let's divide the globe into compartments. Now, the countries that are producing the value chain products, they are limited in this world. The majority of the countries are not producing anything. They're just getting the final end result and importing it, like in Africa or the Middle East. But Africa is a good example of that. So, because I didn't see any African country in the charts David produced, for example. So, what we need to do here is to look at the global picture altogether and see what's missing there. Because we can't just look at the United States and China alone. We have to involve other people. We are the consumers of your goods that you produce, David and Rob. You produce products and we import them. But what we can export to you is the manpower, the intelligence, like in India, for example, or in Jordan. That's something that we can do. We produce a good, intelligent workforce that can work in technology, particularly. Technology is the area that is being threatened now. Now, what did the war in Ukraine show us? The war in Ukraine showed us that many of the countries that are so dependent on agricultural products are now reaching their stance. For example, the Middle East was known to be the breadbasket of the world during the Romans. It was the breadbasket of the world. Now we're importing meat from Ukraine. So Ukraine is making it a problem for bread in our country. A problem for bread is a problem for everybody, as you know. So what I'm saying here is let's look at the global picture, not just the picture of the big players in this thing, not just the problem of the suppliers of value chain and the receivers of the value chain products. And that's what I'm saying here. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I request Mr. Donald.
Hi.
I don't.
Well, I want to say that I just want to mention that the ports in California actually have been clear for a while, according to the Wall Street Journal. So that's a good thing. Yeah. in theory, going back to all the way to Ricardo in the late 1700s, the the idea is what is comparative advantage, which is the idea that some places are better at doing things than other places, so that it doesn't make sense for a country that's good at making one thing to make something that they're not as good at making. It makes more sense for them to get it from a country that's better at making it. So international trade makes everybody better off. One thing that we've been focusing on is manufacturing, and it's important to understand that a lot of the trade that's important and valuable to us has to do with things that are a little more simple, like food. And one of the things that's happening right now that's kind of tragic is that a huge amount of the grain that the world gets comes from Russia and from Ukraine. And it's a frightening issue about some of the countries that depend on that, especially in Africa, is a question, are they going to be able to get enough food? So these kinds of things, when we look at value chains or global supply chains, are things that we need to really consider. Right now, because of the disruption, for a couple of reasons, there's sadly all over the world, there's become this nativism and this nationalism, which is sadly a kind of feeds into fascism, and it's a very, very disturbing trend. And I'm glad that a lot of people are, aware of it and starting to, especially young people are fighting against it. But in the United States, it's manifesting itself as this whole idea that we should make everything ourselves here. And so the United States is spending a huge amount of money moving its semiconductor industry into the United States so that it won't be buying things from other places. And that's an example of what I'm saying. We're gonna spend a lot more money making things than somebody else would spend. We're gonna do it less well, and it's gonna cost more money, and it's going to affect negatively the people who could have done a better job doing it. So cutting back trade and doing this nativist stuff is not a useful thing to do. So there needs to be balance, because I'm not a person that thinks that we have the capability of managing economies completely through centralized manner, because we just simply don't. I agree with the Austrians in that, to a degree, in that is that we just don't have enough information available to understand what everybody's needs are in a real-time basis, to be able to keep things organized. But I also think that within economies, that if they're just left to go in a complete laissez-faire way, so they get incredibly out of balance, like the United States is right now, where the very, very wealthy control most of the wealth in the United States, and there's a very few people control most of the wealth, and the rest is distributed among everybody else, the small amount, and that is leading to instability. So countries like Finland and the Nordic countries have found ways, many countries have found ways of being more egalitarian by taxation and various kinds of antitrust regulations and things like that. Now, what needs to happen is that those kinds of regulations, or those kinds of basically guardrails, need to be happening on a global scale. So we need to be able to start having the countries working together to come up with ways that we can manage these supply chains and manage the relationships between countries in ways that we don't wind up with one country that's super powerful, like just draining other countries, which is what's happened, in the past, where the colonial powers have drained the resources of weaker countries. And that's, one way that it becomes a supply chain, because somebody takes the resources of a less developed country and just completely destabilizes the country and wrecks them. We need to find ways of managing that, but that has to be managed at a global level. And right now, there's a trend towards the opposite, which is there's a trend, especially, in the United States and elsewhere, of saying, globalization's terrible. We've got to stop it. It's the worst thing in the world. But I don't know how, but that's not right. We have to figure out ways of switching that and trying to understand that these interactions, these flows of materials and knowledge and things like that are ultimately global, whether we want them to be or not, and that we need to work at a global level to be able to start managing them in a way that's beneficial for everyone, because even the people that are wealthy are going to wind up in trouble if we don't do it. So there. That's what I have to say.
Thank you. So, Deputy Smith, what's your concluding remarks?
I love the panel you have on today. Great insights from everyone on the show. I love how we've all come to consensus that global value chains are, as the first word says, they're global, and they affect every country and company in very different ways globally. And I'm always love being reminded that just like we see with artificial intelligence, machine learning systems, there's biases in there. I like being reminded when I'm showing too much of my biases too with a US-centric view. And so I appreciate that reminder today. But I do want to say that global value chains, as you saw from the information before on international value chains, that they are a thing that started decades ago. And we're continuing to move through these international value chains. And we saw during the financial crisis that they failed and dramatically declined. We also saw that during COVID, the dramatic fall. And we know they're shifting, as Rob had said earlier. And we're knowing nations are retooling, companies are retooling, and they're looking at how do they survive. How do they balance the risk reward of low cost versus sustainable, predictable outcomes? And we're seeing, as Rob always reminds us, that the simulation and modeling tools are excellent for getting this done. So, Sharif, I think that's my final remarks.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, if Donald brought up the CHIPS Act and the movement of microprocessors into the United States, and it's an interesting decision, predominantly because what really drove it wasn't so much, that was part of it, but wasn't so much the loss of the ability to build automobiles and some of the industries that shut down because China was shut down and parts of Taiwan was shut down. It was the concern that if we ended up in a war with China and China was building a lot of the parts we needed for weapons, it was going to be a problem. much like Russia's experience in the war with Ukraine. They can't build advanced weapons at the moment. They can't get the parts. And so they're massively trying to spin up capacity in Russia without the skills to do it. Of course, they've also scared an entire generation of men who exited the country. So I don't know how they figure they're going to staff these facilities once they build them. But in the end, it was a desire. It was actually the biggest desire was national security. If you can't build what you need to defend your country, or defend whatever the hell it is you're defending, you're pretty much out of the conflict, and that was a big enough concern to bring things in place. I think overall, what we need to stop doing is stop looking at supply chains tactically. We need to start looking at them strategically for those things that you absolutely have to have for national defense, for a good chunk of your population, like agriculture. You need to make sure that you've got control over an adequate amount to assure your state. If you're a government and you can't feed your people, you've got a problem, and that problem isn't something you're going to fix by next Tuesday. And yet with food, you kind of have to fix it by next Tuesday. People can't go without food for a long period of time. Fresh water is even worse. So assuring those supplies, knowing that the world is often a hostile and changing place, should be a much higher priority for governments than they are. And I'm a big believer in making sure at least the core aspects of what your government, what your country needs to survive, should be within control of the government. They can't fix something they can't touch. And if it breaks outside of their control, they're still screwed. It's not like the government can raise their hand and say, hey, the reason we can't feed you is because of something China did. Your citizens aren't going to say, oh yeah, well, that's good. We're going to leave you in position because it really wasn't your fault. Populations revolt over food and water shortages, and what you absolutely don't want to have is a revolt. So whether you're a government or a large scale company, you need to do whatever is needed to assure your continued operation. And as I mentioned before, with IT, we came up with the idea of hot sites. If you had a disaster or problem, you'd fail over to a hot site, and a lot of the employees could transfer to that hot site and spin it up within hours, as opposed to spinning it up within months or years, which would happen if you didn't have a hot site. We need manufacturing hot sites. We can have a weather event. We can have a political event. We can have a war. We need to think through what it would take to create a level of redundancy we currently don't have. And Russia's a showcase of what can happen, whether you're Ukraine or Russia, when you don't do that, and you get into a conflict and you have a major problem. Ukraine can't build what they need. Russia can't build what they need. You can point at Russia and say, well, it's kind of their fault. Maybe they should have done better planning. But that's the point. Nobody's doing better planning. And if you're making decisions based on the idea that you're going to have some type of capacity in place and you haven't assured that capacity, you're making a stupid decision, because you're basing that decision on a set of events that you have no odds on. You can't bet on. If you were to walk into Las Vegas and make these kinds of bets, people would laugh you out of the room. Though I should point out, people should probably laugh a lot of people that bet in Las Vegas out of the room because they have no idea what the odds are and they're just wasting their money. But CEOs are doing that same kind of wasting at scale, and they're paid to make these decisions, and they need to make these decisions in a very measured, strategic way. And they need to assure the capabilities of the firm. We're watching Elon Musk, for instance, right now completely destroy both Tesla and Twitter. That's incredibly irresponsible. And you could see it wouldn't have taken a genius to model out that these outcomes were going to occur when he stepped in. His buyers were known. The behavior of the Twitter advertisers were known. It would not have been hard to model and to showcase that here's a quick way to not only stop being the richest man in the world, but to be the guy that lost more money than anybody else in history over a shorter period of time, something you would think he wouldn't want to do. This lack of ability to make strategic decisions at a top executive level is one of the biggest problems I think we face right now as a world. And if we can improve the strategic decision making capability of those top executives, and particularly politicians, and often politicians are making decisions that aren't in their best interest, let alone their constituents' best interest. And if we could just use modeling more aggressively and more effectively to show the outcomes of the decisions these people are making, the likely outcomes of the decisions these people are making, I think most of them would make different decisions and better decisions going forward. And Lord knows we need people to make better decisions going forward, because decisions they're being made right now are creating a global mess, supply chain or not. So in the end, if we're going to address this problem of global value chain and really do a better job, we need to do it strategically. We need to use the resources we have to better model the outcomes, so decisions are made based on facts and what we know about the odds, and move away from these gut decisions that are done in a panic after the fact on events that we could have forecast but didn't, to cover up the fact that we were negligent and not doing adequate planning. And by the way, one final thing, we need to get off this blame game where the first thing we do is find somebody to shoot when a bad decision is made. We first need to do the analysis, determine what needs to be done differently, and then decide who needs to be shot. Because we're often shooting the very people that we're trying to fix the problem, not the people that created it, because they're the easier scapegoats. So in the end, we need to create a better world. We need to create better decision makers, and to create better decision makers, we need to use the tools we've got to do simulation and force people to operate strategically as opposed to tactically.
Mhm. Thank you. Now I request Dr. Talib.
Okay, I listened to Bob and I listened to David, and they're both saying very logical things now. Especially David. David, your first comment about your attitude was a very welcomed comment. Thank you so much for that. And Rob, I think what your conclusion is the decision-making process in this world has to be reviewed, whether it's governments or businessmen. That's a very important fact. But the problem is that there is no decision-making in developing countries, not our part of the world. Decision-making here only affects minor things. It doesn't affect the major things. We're importing everything, including our food. And that's keeping many of us really poor. So what we have to look at here is governments only. Governments are responsible for that. They're the ones that can do make or break. Again, when you talk about the business people, you talk about Tesla and the owners of Tesla and Twitter. You're talking about American model in that, because you have businessmen that are able to change the world by their actions or non-actions, as you correctly said. We can't have tactical decisions. We have to have strategic decisions. That's very important. Now, what I want to say at the end of this is, it's a global problem. We should look at it globally. Really, we cannot just look at it from one perspective. I think Donald also hinted at that. So that's what I want to say for concluding remark. Now, we have to think globally. We have to be strategic. We have to decide who's the decision maker. So they're going to affect the lives of people in different parts of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Donald, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, I was kind of amused with what Rob said, because I agree with everything he said, and he's always really very insightful.
I agree.
What amused me is when I took programming for the first time on punch cards back in 1978, my programming professor said almost exactly the same thing about how we should be modeling and that computer models were going to allow us to make better decisions. And it was almost word for word the same thing Rob said, and that was a very long time ago. And that is definitely not something that we've gotten around to doing yet. But one thing that we have gotten around to doing, interestingly enough, is back then when you traveled across Europe, at every single solitary border, you'd have to take out your passport, and they'd search your car, and you'd have to exchange your money from one country's money to another country's money, and you'd have to carry money as you travel around Europe. You'd have to have marks and francs and every other kind of money, and now you don't. You just drive from one country to another, and you use the same money in all of the countries. And so all of a sudden, instead of it being a lot of different countries, the people have common exchange. And right now, in Africa, it's very, very difficult to basically ship something from one country to another, because the way that the settlements happen is that if you basically write a check from one country to another, that in order to do the settlements, they send it to settlement banks in London and New York. They don't have a Pan-African settlement bank. But that's changing now. They've just started this Inter-African Trade Organization, where they're working together now for the first time to be able to start allowing Africans to be able to ship things from one African country to another African country, and they're creating an African settlement bank so that they'll be able to, so that won't be true anymore. So Africans can start to exchange. It's the first step towards an EU for Africa. And just think, there's an EU in Europe, there's an EU, there'll be an EU, possibly an EU in Africa. And so things that you would never think are possible, if you said to yourself, hey, it's possible for people to get together and work out problems, not on a country scale, like we're talking. One way that we're talking about is, okay, we could have the redundancy in our country so that every problem that our country has, we have backup for it, and our country can, solve all these problems by ourselves. Or we can have a situation where we can say, we're going to get a bunch of countries together, and we're all going to work together, and we're going to figure out when we have these problems, how we're going to solve these problems together. And that sounds like ridiculous dream, but look, it's happened. It's happened in Europe. It's happening in Africa. It's something that actually can happen, and is happening. So it's something, I don't think that you're ever going to have a country that the reason that Russia and Ukraine grow so much wheat is because the climate and the soil is really, really good for it. I mean, there's some countries that they could want to grow wheat as much as they wanted to grow wheat, and they're just not going to be able to grow wheat because they don't have the soil, they don't have the climate, and they still need to eat. And so what we have to do is look at what do these countries have that are valuable. Every country has people in it, and the people are valuable. I worked for a country whose data center was in Oman. It was a Silicon Valley company, and our computers, the computers that we used to do our work. It was a company that basically did AI, and the computers that we used to do the AI were in Amman, Jordan. That's where they were. So every place has value, and maybe they can't grow wheat in one place, but they can have data centers. I mean, it's just a matter of us looking at that and being able to manage that and it doesn't even have to be trust, because it's not, the EU isn't completely about trust. It's, they've developed a legal structure and a structure that actually works, and they're doing that now in Africa. So I think that that's what we really is the solution and the future of supply chains. And so
That's right.
that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Don.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent discussion. Definitely, we can understand how this global value chain work. Especially coming March, World Talent Economy Forum working with India Global Chamber of Commerce. We have a good news. The speakers, those who regularly attend in World Talent Economy Forum, the Indian government agency want to invite you all in India in a 2 days conference. It's completely business-oriented conference, B2B. Very, very exclusive conference, and all of our 50 speakers will get sponsorship from the government agencies. So those who are interested to work on these projects, they can share their necessary documents, and we can take initiative. And our conference in 27 to 28 March in New Delhi. So thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. This is the way actually World Talent Economy Forum working. Our dialogue is important. Besides this dialogue, we are taking a lot of action with government agency, corporation, and academia. This create an impact. Now all of the government agencies and largest corporations, they start to believe that World Talent Economy Forum is the ultimately way of futures, and how our speakers contributing is really, really valuable for emerging economy. Thank you, Dr. Talib Rafael. Thank you, Mr. Rob. Thank you, Mr. Donald, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Rob. Bye.
It was nice to see you guys. Bye.
Nice to see you. Bye. Take care.